So it seems that Grey Knights have taken a couple of fairly hefty nerfs, and Thousand Sons have an amount of changes that will make Tzeentch proud. Let's take a look at the new FAQ and erratas for the two books. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, and it's seeming like it's going to be a fairly FAQ heavy week, as not only do we have the Orcs, but now we have the Grey Knights and Thousand Sons ones out as well. People always do tend to be a bit negative when Games Workshop FAQ their books, occasionally making small changes and clarifications to the rules, and largely they don't tend to try and rebalance the game rules with this update, though they've perhaps strayed into that territory on one of the changes for Grey Knights. Personally, I do prefer that they publish these clarifications sooner rather than later. They tend to just crop up around edge case scenarios anyway, rather than making changes to the core rules, and it's certainly a lot better than 7th edition and previously, when they just publish a rulebook and not clear up any areas of ambiguity. I do get why some people get frustrated with it though. It can be annoying when rules are changed shortly after they've been released, and the ideal situation would be just for the rules to be loophole free in the first place. Maybe could be a subject for another video. In any case, let's take a look at what we've got in these two books. We'll go for the Grey Knights first, then go on to the Thousand Sons. So for the Grey Knights FAQ and errata, it's largely quite short and sweet. 3 fairly obvious clarifications that was perfectly clear what they intended, and 1 actual change to the rules, which is a nerf to the Tide of Convergence's Mortal Wound ability. Let's go through the simple stuff first. First up, Empiric Declamation, the 2 command points to Autopass and Litany. That one's been clarified to say that it's definitely got to be one of the litanies that you know. It can't just be any litany whatsoever. I think that was implied, but the wording was a little ambiguous. The Vortex of Doom and Warlord trait that gets you extra mortal wounds has been clarified again. They've just doubly made sure that you don't get the mortal wounds on the splash damage, the ones where the Vortex of Doom deals out a single mortal wound to each enemy unit nearby. That seems perfectly clear rules as intended to me from the wording on the Warlord trait. They do specifically call it out. I'm not too sure which loopholes people were trying to make, so that Games Workshop felt that they need to FAQ it a second time, even though they specifically addressed it already. The other fairly straightforward clarification is to Words of Power, that really powerful chaplain litany that gets you mortal wounds on 6s. They have confirmed that yes, that is an extra mortal wound on top of the mortal wound that you'd normally get from Tide of Convergence. That did seem to be how it was written on the litany itself, though I must admit the wording wasn't 100% clear about that. It's interesting though that these mortal wounds haven't got the change that the Tide of Convergence mortal wounds have. So finally that does bring us on to the Tide of Convergence change, which is the one where your nemesis weapons in close combat will get a mortal wound on a wound roll of a 6. It's pretty powerful, particularly in combination with Hammerhand and Words of Power, that chaplain litany, as it means that you could re-roll all rolls to wound, and potentially drown the enemy unit under an absolutely silly amount of mortal wounds. The change that they've chosen to make to it is that it's now capped at 6 mortal wounds per unit per phase, so it means that the Tide of Convergence alone isn't going to usually be wiping out entire squads by itself, though admittedly 6 mortal wounds is quite a hefty amount, and it should still leave a big mark. The vast majority of the time it won't make too much difference, I think. To actually be generating 6 mortal wounds reliably with Tide of Convergence, you need a maxed out strike squad, and to be re-rolling all their wounds with Hammerhand. If they did happen to acquire a bunch of buffs though, say extra attacks and exploding 6s from the Rapier's Brotherhood, then it does mean that you could be hitting more than 6 quite reliably. I think Games Workshop maybe made that change just to try and stop a strike squad from basically being able to almost auto-delete anything in the game if they had the right buffs applied. Don't get me wrong though, even with this restriction they're still going to do a hefty amount of damage. If you're getting an absolute ton of 6s on the enemy anyway, then it means that you're going to be doing quite a lot of wounds with your Nemesis Force weapons regular damage, and they've all got decent AP and damage too. What I find really quite weird though is that if you do have that Words of Power litany available, then that one appears not to be capped. It means that you still could get one strike squad do an absolutely crazy amount of mortal wounds. Only 6 from the standard Tide of Convergence mortal wounds, but then an absolute ton more from Words of Power. Maybe seems just a little bit of an odd change to me, but for the most part I don't think it's too bad of a nerf. It's only really going to matter if you're just trying to focus literally all of your buffs on one strike squad, as opposed to a whole bunch of Grey Knights units across an army. Overall, not too bad for the Grey Knights, I think. 3 perfectly sensible clarifications that are how I would have played it anyway, and 1 nerf to those mortal wounds that isn't going to be too relevant in the vast majority of cases. I kind of wonder if they did really need to nerf all that badly though. It doesn't really seem like they're sweeping to dominance at the top of tournaments, much like Admech and Drakari were as soon as they came out. Next up though, let's move on to Thousand Sons, who have really quite a lot of updates and errata, though maybe nothing quite as big a change as the Grey Knights have. First up, the Capricious Crest, the relic that allows you to swap one enemy roll of a 6 to a 1 when they cast a psychic test. They've changed that so the enemy cannot use a command reroll to reroll the psychic test after that's been done, so I'd say that's a small buff for that particular relic. Their Smokescreen stratagem has just had a keyword change, just to make it rules as written functional on things like the Defiler and some Forge World tanks. Before it was weirdly excluded from Thousand Sons vehicles, it was only Arcana Astartes. There's a few clarifications to the relatively unusual relic of the Conniving Plate. That's the defensive relic that a sorcerer can wear, and it means that enemy units in engagement range can only direct half their attacks towards that sorcerer. They've just made a few clarifications to that, such as saying when you halve the attacks you round up, halving the attacks happens after you've gained any initial bonus attacks, such as extra attacks for certain relics or war gear, or things like Space Marine Shock Assault. Anyone who's making those attacks can then still use the other half of their attacks to target something else if something else is in range, and if you generate any bonus attacks while you're making the attack sequence, those ones are unaffected and can still be applied to the original unit that they were targeting with the attacks that generated them. It seems there's a surprising amount to consider when you are thinking about writing rules that halve enemy attacks in close combat apparently. Another relic that's been changed is the Prism of Echoes, which was one that boosted the range on blessing powers. I think it was fairly obvious just in the way it was worded, but they have clarified that yes, the boosted range only happens to the range of the blessing power itself, not to any measurements that are talked about in the actual effect of the spell, so you can't use it to have extra long range bolters, for example. They've updated the wording on the Infernal Master's packs, clarifying that you can only make one pact per master in the command phase. Again, I'm not entirely sure that needed a clarification. It seemed kind of hard to read that any differently by the original rule. For the Rubric Marines, they've clarified that they do only get one power from either Change or Vengeance, not one from both disciplines. Again, that's how I would have guessed it would have worked, but it was maybe a little bit confusing because they said and or the other discipline, not just or the other discipline. For the Hellbrute, they've deleted the Malicious Volleys rule. That one had still been printed on the datasheet, despite the Bolt Discipline / Malicious Volleys no longer applying to Dreadnought equivalents. Kind of a shame for the Thousand Sons with their powerful Inferno combi bolters, but it does bring it in line with all of the Space Marine books in 9th edition. And finally for the changes, it appears that they have updated the wording on the Fatecaster Great Bow. That's the Zangor Enlightened one, where if they fire Overwatch they will still hit on a 2+ now, rather than the normal 6 to hit. I guess that's a small buff for those guys. I'm still not sure if they're going to be worth taking though. So those are the main rules changes, but they've also issued a fair few FAQs as well, some of which I've already mentioned in the Conniving Plate. They've confirmed that the Dilettant Legion Command ability does indeed give an extra relic without any additional investment. You don't have to buy it in with command points or anything, which I think made sense seeing as you have to pay a fair amount of points for it, but it wasn't actually spelled out. The Schemes of Change stratagem, the one that allows you to swap a secondary objective out for another once you've seen the opponent's ones, that one has interestingly been confirmed that you can use it multiple times if you want to. So I guess in theory, once you've seen your opponent's secondary objectives, you could completely repick them if you wanted to, and you were willing to sacrifice some CP. I guess that could genuinely be quite powerful at really top level play, but I think for the vast majority of people, you're best off just picking the best secondaries to start with, and not wasting command points on swapping them around once you've seen your opponents. Next up is a rather nice clarification to the Pact from Beyond Kabbalistic Ritual, which could be really good for farming out some more mortal wounds. That's the Kabbalistic Ritual ability that allows you to cast a psychic power on the lowest casting value that it would go off. It means that say if you cast Smite multiple times and then the difficulty increases, if you got to the point where you'd be casting a Super Smite, casting it on an 11 for example, then you would get the full D6 mortal wounds instead of the standard D3. That could be really quite fun if you want to guarantee a really powerful mortal wound blitz on one opponent, and you've got enough psychers throughout your army to push that smite all the way up to the maximum. As I say in the FAQ, it could also be useful for things that need a casting value of a 9, like the Warped Regeneration stratagem to heal a few wounds if you make a big cast. They've confirmed that you can't use the Kabbalistic powers to stop a Deny the Witch roll. Say if the opponent rolled a very low Deny the Witch roll that was only just enough to stop you, you can't then go back and use the Kabbalistic Ritual to increase the casting value to make that Deny the Witch not work. Those ones just remain a tool that you can use for trying to make the psychic powers go off in the first place and not counter Deny the Witch. Lastly is arguably a small buff to Master Misinformator. That one's a very relevant and quite powerful warlord trait from the Cult of Duplicity, where it allows you to redeploy D3 units at the start of the game, and this FAQ means that you can now use that to put them in the webway or deep strike them, say if the unit redeployed was Scarab Occult Terminators. So overall, mainly a whole bunch of fairly small interactions clarified for the Thousand Suns, most of them likely how I would have played them anyway. Quite a nice buff to that Capricious Crest to stop the opponent interfering with it with command rerolls, and the Fatecaster Great Bow hitting on a 2+ in Overwatch is quite handy as well. So as always, let me know what you think of the FAQs, errata and changes down in the comments below. Is it good news or bad news for the Grey Knights and the Thousand Suns? And let me know if I've missed anything important or glossed over any big implications. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep up with any new rules that Games Workshop puts out for 40k here on the channel. Finally, if you have been watching all the videos a lot and are getting good value out of them, I would just like to quickly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.